Police charging all 31 with conspiracy to riot, noting they planned to swarm several parts of Coeur d'Alene and carried paperwork similar to an operations plan that a police or military group would put together. They traveled in from states all across the country, allegedly united by white nationalism.
They appeared to be affiliated with the group Patriot Front.
Why are white nationalists targeting a pride parade in Idaho or anywhere? Historian Kathleen Belew is the author of Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement in Paramilitary America. She's an expert on these kinds of movements. Professor Belew, thank you so much for making time for us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So I've learned a lot of what I know about white power groups in this country and paramilitary movements in this country from your scholarship. But I wanted to ask you about this impression that I have from recent news, from the sedition indictments for the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, for what we saw this weekend in Idaho. I have this sense, this impression that these groups are now operating sort of as an adjunct, a pretty close adjunct to what's happening in very right-wing electoral politics. They seem to be targeting the same targets, at least, that are being singled out by right-wing Republican politicians. That feels unnerving to me, and I wanted to ask you if that stands out to you.
I think that's very concerning. And we don't know as much about that interface between mainstream politics and paramilitary white power activism in the militant right as we do about the fringe of the movement. But what we do know is that these groups are inherently opportunistic, and they're prepared to use any open window to recruit and radicalize and foment violence. And it's worth just mentioning that when we say the word white nationalist, sometimes people think that means overzealous patriotism. But for these activists, the nation they envision is not the United States. It's a transnational group of white people. It is a white ethno-state. It is not the America defined by democracy and multiculturalism and multiracial identity that is the one that we live in. It is a imaginary all-white state. So this is a very extremist movement. It's drawing in people, as you mentioned, from all over the country. And the reason that we're seeing so many of these stories at the same time about Oath Keepers, Patriot Front, Proud Boys, the January 6th hearings, all of these things are happening at the same time because this isn't a story about any one of these groups. This is a story about a groundswell. And even though it appears as disconnected pods of activism, it's meant to do that. What it is a nationwide paramilitary army that is prepared to do battle for its own purposes. Now, how much that can be wielded by the Republican Party, even on the very fringe, I think is open to question.
What do you make of the reports, including from NBC News, that after arresting these Patriot Front members in Idaho, the actual police officers who arrested some of them in the police department are getting doxxed and are getting threatened? Why are they threatening the police?
Yeah, this has been kind of a push-pull on social media because often there has been a issue with overlap between some of these groups and some people in law enforcement, and I would not paint that with one brush at all. But Coeur d'Alene has a long history of dealing with these movements. Coeur d'Alene was the site of the Aryan Nations compound, which was an epicenter for this activity in the 1980s. It was nearby the headquarter actions for Phineas Priesthood, which is a similar movement in the 90s. Folks up there are not new to this, and they're very aware of how violent it can become and how dramatically it can impact their community. So I think, one thing that stands out to me about the law enforcement response and is sort of emblematized in the doxing is that even structures of power are very much in the crosshairs of this kind of a movement. There are other issues of people's homes being bombed in Coeur d'Alene, of people being run off the road, of people being harassed out of town. It goes on and on like this. And bank robberies in nearby Spokane, Washington. These activists and the movement they come from have done incalculable damage to Coeur d'Alene over time.
Kathleen Belew, the author of Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, which is an essential reference book for our times, I'm sorry. Professor Belew, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.